timeout.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Kenny, and welcome to ESPN Classic's Top 5 Reasons You Can't Blame, a series that takes a fresh look at sports personalities who are remembered largely for their mistakes, controversial moments, or questionable decisions. Our mission is not to further vilify these individuals, but instead to challenge conventional wisdom and re-examine what has been accepted as fact. You'll see new evidence and hear new testimony. Time to open your mind and hear all the nuances of the actual story, not the shorthand version that often resonates through history. In this show, we'll examine one of the most scandalous events in the history of modern sport. We'll count down the reasons why you can't blame the 1919 White Sox for throwing the World Series. The Black Sox scandal resulted in the banishment of 8 Chicago players, including shoeless Joe Jackson, the man with the 3rd highest career batting average of all time. The effect of the Black Sox scandal is still being felt today as we debate the Pete Rose case or any other case in any sport involving betting. Before we defend the Black Sox, let's take a look at the evidence against them.
When the World Series was ready to occur, people really expected the Chicago White Sox to beat the Cincinnati Reds. They were a clear favorite.
The fact is, and they had won the pennant and a World Series in 1917, just 2 years prior.
Ty Cobb once told me that shoeless Joe Jackson was the finest pure hitter he'd ever seen in his life.
For a World Series, you need pitching, and they had pitching. Eddie Seacott and Lefty Williams were both 20-game winners.
Yet as Game 1 of the best-of-9 approached, the odds began to shift in favor of the Reds. Suspicions of a fix were in the air.
Those kind of rumors happened every October. What was different about October of 1919 was that the betting went in that direction too, that a lot of smart money, big money, was going down on the Reds.
The results of Games 1 and 2, which were played in Cincinnati, gave weight to the rumors.
Seacott got knocked out 9-1 Reds in the first game. The second game, a very close game. Lefty Williams loses at 4-2.
The third game, the White Sox won. Then the pattern repeated itself, where the first 2 pitchers, Lefty Williams and Eddie Seacott, who normally won, lost their 2 games.
The White Sox, down 4-1, were on the brink of losing the best-of-9 series. But poor pitching from their aces was not the only reason. Their main RBI man, shoeless Joe Jackson, whose 96 were 3rd in the majors during the regular season, was not productive in the clutch.
In the first 5 games, he came to bat with 10 runners on base, a total of 10 in the first 5 games, 6 of whom were in scoring position, and he never drove in a run.
He hit the only home run of the series when they were already behind in the last game 5-0. It seemed like Joe did most of his damage with the bat when the games were already out of hand.
Cincinnati won the series in 8 games, with its 5 victories coming when either Seacott or Williams started for Chicago. Winning bettors were paid off. White Sox fans grumbled, and baseball's grand old music played on. Then, in September of 1920, a Chicago grand jury, convened to consider the evidence on an unrelated charge, learned of possible improprieties with the previous year's World Series.
The grand jury proceeded for a while. Lo and behold, they started opening this can of worms of what had transpired in the fall of 1919. They began to call people in. They put the fear of the Lord into Seacott, into Lefty Williams, and finally into Jackson.
The prosecutor asked if he had agreed to throw the World Series for $20,000, and Joe said yes, he did. And the prosecutor said, did you accept $5,000? And Joe said yes, he did.
In January of 1921, the owners named Kennesaw Mountain Landis, a hard-line federal judge, baseball's first commissioner. 2 months later, he suspended Jackson, Seacott, Williams, and 5 other alleged co-conspirators. Among the infamous Chicago 8 was first baseman Chick Gandil, who told Sports Illustrated in 1956 of his connection to Boston gambler Sports Sullivan.
He was the person that apparently was first contacted by Chick Gandil in 1919 Gandil told Sullivan, the players are ready to throw the series and need money.
There were 8 men on a team that were going to make sure that the Chicago White Sox, heavily favored, didn't win the World Series.
They all knew what they were doing. People say, well, gee, Joe Jackson was illiterate. He can't read and he can't write. Well, he knew how to count.
Eddie Collins, who was the White Sox second baseman, later said he had no pity for these players who were evicted. He said they knew what they were doing. There were no excuses because they took a crooked course.
There's no question that the players were guilty. What Landis did was make it very clear that throwing games was a capital crime of baseball.
The way he did that was the 8 players who were involved, he banned for life.
While 1919 is often described as the springboard to a golden age of high living and larger-than-life personalities, the decade leading up to it was one of hard times for the working man, including those who toiled in the major leagues. The realities of the time helped frame why you can't blame the Black Sox for throwing the 1919 World Series. Here are some reasons that did not make our top 5. We call them the best of the rest.
Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm. By provoking President Woodrow Wilson to enter World War I, the Kaiser threw baseball, not to mention the rest of America, into a state of anxiety. While many major league players were in uniform, shouldering rifles instead of bats, the summer games slumped at the gate.
The first contingent of American troops to come back came back in December of 1918. Nobody knew how fast the troops were going to come home.
They knew the 1919 season would be played. They didn't know, would the fans come back or not? Everybody's salary was kind of depressed in 1919 because of the previous season. Salaries were somewhat frozen going into 1919, so nobody was getting very much.
What resulted was that it was a banner year for baseball.
If they had realized that that was the case, then they probably would not have been as hardball in their dealings with salaries at the beginning of 1919. And if that had been the case, maybe the Eddie Seacotts of the world might not have been as tempted.
Another best of the rest, Guglielmo Marconi. Some believe that the Black Sox scandal would never have occurred if the inventor of the radio had allowed a communications company, later known as NBC, to connect his talking boxes via a network of commercial stations.
Marconi thought that the idea of commercial radio broadcasts were simply not important enough or viable.
In 1921, the very first national broadcast that was transmitted, the effect of radio on baseball was immediate and dramatic. Salaries went sky high. I think the technology was there so that this could have happened 4, 5, 6, 7 years earlier.
If radio had come along a decade earlier, they would have been playing for bigger stakes, and that scandal probably wouldn't have been possible.
Reason number 5, rampant corruption. Bribery was not limited to the inner workings of municipal governments, political elections, and police departments.
The Chicago in which the White Sox were operating was one of rampant corruption.
There's almost a Wild West feel to some neighborhoods. This is the Chicago where people who have been deceased are frequently voting and voting often.
Betting on baseball was so common that players and gamblers often mixed like peanuts and Cracker Jacks. Moreover, both breeds commonly emanated from the same socioeconomic substrata.
The ball players came out of this world in many ways. They came from poor backgrounds. When they got to cities like Chicago, they hung out with gamblers, with prostitutes.
Al Capone furnished limousines with bulletproof windows on it to haul the White Sox to the ballpark. So, yeah, they were pretty much intermingled.
Gambling was present at baseball matches from the very first paid attendance match, 1858.
The original owners of the New York Yankees were Big Bill Devery, who was perhaps the most corrupt policeman in New York City history, and a fellow named Frank Farrell, who operated a major gambling casino in New York City and 250 pool halls.
Hal Chase was a great ball player. He was, on a number of occasions, accused of gambling.
There was constant gambling. The game was infested with gamblers. And the Black Sox scandal was merely the biggest example of mass gambling that there was.
America wanted to believe it was just the fault of these 8 evil individuals. They did not want to come to terms with the fact that baseball players existed in this very corrupt world, that there's perfectly logical social reasons why they did it, why they thought they could get away with it.
So the idea that the snake invaded the garden, with gambling coming to the formerly pure baseball, is, of course, hogwash.
Did that reason grab you? If not, we've got 4 more to go. Here's reason number 4.
Charles Comiskey, the White Sox owner, had short arms and deep pockets.
Nobody was getting very much. Yes, some of the players were definitely underpaid. Jackson was getting $6,000.
Joe Jackson was constantly compared to Ty Cobb. Ty Cobb was making $20,000.
Certainly Eddie Seacott was underpaid for winning 29 games, getting what, $6,000? Lefty Williams was probably the most underpaid. Here's a guy who had won 24 games, was still getting just over minimum wage with like $2,400.
Comiskey wasn't giving him any, and no other owner was either. No, I think Comiskey deserves blame, absolutely.
They gave them the least amount of meal money when the team was on the road. I think the classic amount was $4 to $5 a day. He paid $3 a day. He was also very stingy about such things as laundering uniforms. And the team would get out there forced to pay their own laundry bills, which was absolutely unheard of in big league circles.
Not only was Comiskey known as a cheapskate, he was an elitist.
None of these players were very well educated. Happy Felsch had a 6th grade education. Shoeless Joe Jackson had no education at all.
Shoeless Joe Jackson, who was one of the best players in the league at that time, was making $6,000 a year. However, Eddie Collins, who was the second baseman and captain of that team, was making $15,000 a year.
Eddie Collins was a college graduate, and the other players resented him both for his education and for his high salary. They're looking for some way to supplement their salary.
And you couldn't blame some of the White Sox for trying to pick up a little loose change here and there.
Who was most responsible for these guys selling out, Comiskey, and squeezing those players and making them easy prey for gamblers?
Lack of a whistleblower. Although rumors flew that something was rotten on the White Sox before and during the 1919 World Series, newspapers didn't report anything specific.
The suspicion among the writers, especially Hugh Fullerton and James Kusenberry, was that there had been business being done, shall we say, by the White Sox players.
The sports writer, Granlund Rice, was told by a friend of his that the series was fixed, and he didn't say anything to anybody.
The rumors reached some of the most powerful men in baseball. Among them, American League President Ban Johnson, White Sox owner Charles Comiskey, and Cubs former owner Charles Wiegman.
Wiegman said that he had heard from Monty Tennis, who was a big gambler in Chicago, that the fix was already on.
He didn't think to tell anybody. Charles Wiegman just didn't think it could happen because a baseball game was hard to fix, let alone a World Series.
I'm sure Comiskey knew. If Charles Wiegman knew, Comiskey knew.
Charlie called it while the series was still on. He warned Ban Johnson, the league president. He said, there's something wrong going on here. He ignored him.
The only publication that vigorously pursued the Black Sox story was one meant to serve the gambling industry.
They tried to bring this to baseball's attention, and baseball really didn't want to hear about it.
That's the way baseball was in those days. Nobody wanted to know the truth because they were afraid of creating any suspicion that people would lose respect for the game.
Anybody could have called for a full investigation. Nobody did that.
Before we get to reason number 2.
Say it ain't so, Joe. Say it ain't so.
Long dismissed as apocryphal is the legend of the broken-hearted boy yelling those words as his hero, Joe Jackson, left the grand jury courtroom. But Roland Geary, who died in 1989, breathed a bit of life into one of the most touching stories in baseball's folklore.
Say it ain't so, Joe. That appeared in a newspaper, and yet no one believes that Joe Jackson ever heard a little kid say those words.
It's possible that he never heard it at all. But the question for me is, did Roland Geary say it?
My husband, Roland Geary, was a 9-year-old boy that was taken to the hearing of Shoeless Joe Jackson, And he's the one that said, "Say it ain't so, Joe." He didn't want his hero to be guilty of any wrongdoing.
But with no photograph or voice tape of the incident, the story, however true it may be, remains beyond the reach of proof.
From all indications, it was fiction made up by Charlie Owen of the Chicago Daily News. I got footage of Joe Jackson coming out of the courtroom and then down and out onto the street, and I don't see any kids there.
The views that the baseball purists like to take, that this event never really happened, all I know is my father said it did happen.
That brings us to reason number 2. The game stats are inconclusive.
You can't judge anything about fixed games by observing the actions of the players. That's the whole nature of fixed games.
Joe Jackson batted 375. That's the highest out of anybody on either side. He hit the only home run on either side. He fielded 30 balls, made no errors. Well, you look at Eddie Collins, who's the hero of the White Sox. He batted 226 and had 2 errors. Now, how do you say Jackson's the one that blew it where Eddie Collins was in there doing everything he could?
Although Jackson admitted he had accepted $5,000 to conspire against his own team in the 1919 World Series, he also suggested in his grand jury testimony that he did not deliver on his promise to the gamblers.
On page 11 of the confession, when they asked Joe, did he play to win? Did he hit to win? Did he run the bases to win? Yes, I did all those things. I played to win.
That wasn't in the newspaper. The fact that he confessed that he took $5,000, that made headlines. But not that he played to win.
Another factor that may have influenced the outcome of the 1919 World Series was the possibility that Eddie Seacott, who notched only 3 of his 29 victories in the final month of his season, was arm-weary.
Coming down the stretch, Seacott started to wane in September. In fact, the last 3 starts of Seacott, he had been hit hard. Even the press was starting to question the condition of Seacott's arm.
There was a rumor before the series that he had developed arm problems. Eddie Seacott wasn't himself. He wasn't able to pitch like a 29-game winner.
They were acquitted. The 7 Chicago players who stood trial were found not guilty of defrauding Charles Comiskey and the public.
There were no sports bribery statutes in the state of Illinois, and so they could not be convicted for throwing a baseball game.
They weren't charged with throwing ball games. They were charged with a fraud against Charles Comiskey's business.
They were acquitted in a court of law from being guilty of conspiracy to defraud the public, a very vague and nebulous charge.
The weight of the prosecution's case was lightened considerably when, at the trial, the defendants declined to testify.
Because it was a criminal trial and because of the Fifth Amendment, no one ever really heard under oath what Seacott, Williams, and Jackson actually did or did not do during the 8 games of the 9-game World Series.
Nothing could be proven. You needed evidence. And what evidence did they have? They had lots of rumors, but how could they prove it?
On August 2nd, 1921, after just 2 hours and 47 minutes of deliberation, the jury acquitted the players.
At this marvelous celebration, the jurors hoisted the ball players on and carried them out in triumphant, greeting in the courtroom a stampede of joy.
But the next day, the players felt the heavy hand of Kennesaw Landis. The commissioner banned for life the 7 defendants and 1 other player suspected of being involved in a fix that may not have been carried out.
He never really did an investigation. He just waited until the trial was over and then suspended them for life.
Jackson felt that he had been exonerated by the court and that Judge Landis had exceeded his authority.
I would imagine my dad was, totally shocked, because if I was vindicated in a court of law, I would think that it's over.
They paid the price for all the problems that baseball was having with gambling.
History blames the players, but I don't think it's fair to blame the players unless you've got them some evidence in court against them, which you don't. They were acquitted in court.
History has been harsh toward the Black Sox. While the players were considered outlaws, with some playing in semi-pro leagues, Joe Jackson was used decades later to romanticize the redemption of a father-son relationship in the novel that spawned the movie Field of Dreams. Even aficionados of the sport are split on how history should judge these men. Hopefully, we've given you something to think about. I'm Brian Kenny. Thanks for joining me.